when a small homeless boy shouted, "Don't taste that," at one of the city's most powerful billionaires, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Le Maison wasn't just any restaurant, it was where old money met new power, where deals worth billions were sealed over plates of gold leaf-garnished delicacies. The gentle hum of expensive conversation mixed with the soft clink of fine china, while waiters in pressed black uniforms glided between tables like silent shadows. At the best table in the house sat Maxwell Stone, his presence commanding attention without trying. At 72, he'd built his tech empire from nothing, turning a small startup into the kind of company that could buy social media giants without blinking. His platinum watch and tailored suit spoke of wealth, but his eyes held the sharp focus of someone who never stopped working, never stopped watching. But today, something was off. His movements were slower than usual, his attention divided. Beside him sat Sarah Stone, his wife of 8 months. At 35, she looked like she'd stepped out of a luxury magazine cover, not a hair out of place, her designer dress perfectly fitted, her red lipstick precisely applied. But if you looked closely, really closely, you'd notice her smile never quite reached her eyes. Her manicured fingers kept adjusting her diamond bracelet, her gaze constantly flicking between her husband and her phone. Just outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a small figure lingered in the shadows. Tommy was 12, though he looked younger, his oversized jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. Most people walked past him without a second glance, but Tommy saw everything. He had to. That's how you survive on the streets. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned the restaurant interior, taking in every detail, every movement, every subtle shift in the scene before him. He didn't know it yet, but in the next few minutes, he would change the course of multiple lives, including his own. The stage was set, the players in position, and what happened next would shake the foundations of privilege and power, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes come in the smallest packages. Tommy's stomach growled as he watched the waiter approach with a bottle of expensive wine, presenting it to Maxwell with practiced elegance. Sarah's eyes followed every movement, her red lips curving into a smile as the waiter described the rare vintage. "Perfect," she purred, her voice smooth as silk. "Darling, this is just what we need to celebrate your latest acquisition." Maxwell nodded absently, his attention caught by something on his phone screen. "I need to freshen up," Sarah announced, rising gracefully from her chair. Tommy watched as she walked toward the restroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor. But something wasn't right. Just before entering, she paused, glancing around quickly before reaching into her designer purse. Tommy's eyes narrowed as he saw her palm something small, a tiny vial that caught the light for just a moment before disappearing into her closed fist. When she returned, her movements were different, more calculated, more precise. Maxwell was still distracted by his phone, responding to what looked like an urgent email. Sarah's hand moved with practiced ease as she leaned across the table, seemingly adjusting the flower centerpiece. But Tommy saw it, the quick twist of her wrist, the clear liquid falling into Maxwell's wine glass, disappearing instantly into the dark red liquid. Tommy's heart began to pound against his ribs. His palms grew sweaty despite the evening chill. He knew what he'd just witnessed, but the weight of this knowledge felt like a boulder on his chest. Who would believe him? He was just a street kid, the kind of child people crossed the road to avoid. His worn jacket and scuffed shoes didn't exactly scream credibility. "To us," Sarah said, raising her own glass, her voice carrying a note of finality that made Tommy's skin crawl. "And to all our future endeavors." Maxwell finally put down his phone, reaching for his wine glass. Tommy watched in horror as the billionaire's fingers closed around the stem, lifting it toward his lips. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching like taffy. In that moment, Tommy thought of his own grandfather, how he always taught him that doing the right thing wasn't about what other people would think, but about what you'd think of yourself afterward. The memory hit him like a physical force, pushing him into action. He couldn't stand by and watch this happen, no matter the consequences. His legs were moving before his brain could catch up, his heart thundering in his ears. The words burst from Tommy's throat before he could second-guess himself. "Don't taste that." His voice cracked with urgency, echoing through the suddenly silent restaurant. The crystal glasses seemed to pause mid-clink, conversations died mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to the small figure who had somehow slipped past the maitre d'. Maxwell Stone froze, his wine glass suspended inches from his lips, eyes widening as they landed on Tommy. Sarah's reaction was instant, her perfectly composed facade cracking for just a split second before she recovered. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Who let this child in here?" The maitre d' was already hurrying over, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Stone. I'll remove him immediately." But Tommy stood his ground, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. "She put something in your wine," he said, his voice steadier now, pointing at Sarah. "I saw her. When you were looking at your phone, she poured something from a little bottle." A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Other diners leaned forward in their seats, wine glasses forgotten, their own dramas temporarily abandoned for this unfolding scene. Sarah let out a laugh, but it sounded hollow, forced. "This is ridiculous," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Look at him, he's clearly just trying to cause trouble. Probably wants money or attention." But Maxwell didn't lift the glass to his lips. Instead, he set it down slowly, his weathered face turning to study his wife. "Is that true, Sarah?" His voice was quiet but carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Sarah's perfectly manicured nails dug into her palm. "Maxwell, darling, you can't seriously be listening to this street urchin?" Tommy took a step closer to the table, despite the maitre d's attempt to hold him back. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "Check her purse. The bottle's still in there. I saw everything." His eyes met Maxwell's, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition perhaps, or maybe just the simple, stark truth that sometimes the most honest words come from the most unexpected sources. The restaurant had gone so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Phones had begun to emerge from purses and pockets, their cameras quietly recording the scene. Sarah's composure was slipping further, her practiced smile becoming more of a grimace. "This is absurd," she said, reaching for her purse and clutching it close. "Maxwell, please. Let's just have them remove this boy and enjoy our evening." But Maxwell's face had changed. The successful businessman who had built an empire on reading people was now fully present, his eyes sharp as they moved between his wife's face and the death grip she had on her designer purse. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a new edge, "why don't you show us what's in your purse?" Sarah's face drained of color, but she quickly painted on a smile that looked more like a grimace. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Are you really going to let some filthy street kid ruin our evening?" She clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles turning white against the expensive leather. Maxwell didn't respond immediately, instead raising his hand to signal a nearby waiter. "Please call security," he said calmly, "and have them contact the police." The waiter nodded and hurried away, his shoes clicking against the marble floor. Sarah shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Police? Maxwell, you can't be serious. This is just some pathetic attempt at attention from a homeless brat." Tommy stood his ground, though his heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. "I saw her," he insisted, his voice growing stronger. "She took out a small vial of clear glass with some kind of liquid inside. She waited until you were distracted and poured it in your wine. I saw everything from outside." A murmur rippled through the restaurant as other diners began to piece things together. "Come to think of it," an elderly woman at the next table spoke up, "I did see her fumbling with something in her purse earlier." Another diner chimed in, and she was acting rather strange when she came back from the restroom. Sarah's composure was crumbling by the second. She grabbed her designer coat from the back of her chair, nearly knocking over her own untouched wine glass. "I don't have to stand here and listen to these lies. Maxwell, if you want to believe some street rat over your own wife, then dash. Sit down, Sarah." Maxwell's voice was quiet but carried an authority that made everyone freeze. The police are on their way. If you're innocent, you have nothing to worry about. His eyes hadn't left her face, studying every micro-expression with the same attention to detail that had made him a billionaire. Tommy watched as Sarah's perfectly manicured hand trembled, her purse still clutched tightly to her chest. A small bead of sweat had formed on her forehead, smudging her immaculate makeup. The restaurant had become so quiet you could hear the gentle clink of ice cubes settling in water glasses. Through the windows, the flash of approaching police lights began to paint the elegant walls in alternating red and blue. 2 police officers entered Le Maison, their uniforms a stark contrast to the elegant evening wear of the diners. The maitre d' guided them quickly to Maxwell's table, where Sarah had sunken back into her chair, her face a mask of barely contained panic. "What seems to be the problem here?" the first officer asked, his hand resting casually on his belt as he surveyed the scene. Maxwell gestured to the wine glass. "This young man," he said, nodding toward Tommy, "claims he witnessed my wife adding an unknown substance to my drink." The officer's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "Is that right?" he asked, turning to Tommy. "Can you tell me exactly what you saw?" Tommy swallowed hard but spoke clearly, just as he'd learned to do when talking to shelter workers. "She went to the bathroom first, but stopped before going in. That's when she took out this small glass bottle from her purse. When she came back, she waited until Mr. Stone was looking at his phone, then poured it into his wine. It was clear liquid, and she stirred it in with her knife." The second officer had moved closer to Sarah, who was now visibly trembling. "Ma'am, would you mind if we took a look in your purse?" Sarah clutched it tighter, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This is harassment. I'm Maxwell Stone's wife. You can't possibly believe this vagrant over me." "If you have nothing to hide, Sarah," Maxwell said quietly, "then showing them your purse should end this quickly." The restaurant had gone completely silent, dozens of phones recording every moment. Sarah's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal's, searching for an escape route. Suddenly, she shoved back from the table and tried to dash past the officers, but her heel caught on the plush carpet. Her purse flew open as she stumbled, and a small glass vial rolled across the floor, coming to rest right at Tommy's feet. Time seemed to freeze as everyone stared at the innocent-looking bottle. "That's it," Tommy said softly. "That's what she had." The first officer quickly retrieved the vial while his partner secured Sarah, who had finally cracked completely. "Fine," she screamed, mascara running down her cheeks. "You want the truth? I couldn't take it anymore. 8 months of playing the perfect wife, waiting for him to add me to his will. Do you know what it's like living in his shadow, having to ask permission for every little thing? That empire should have been mine. All mine." The restaurant erupted into chaos as Sarah's confession hung in the air. "Ma'am, you're under arrest," the first officer said firmly, producing handcuffs while his partner carefully bagged the vial as evidence. Sarah struggled weakly, her designer dress now wrinkled, her perfect makeup streaked with tears. "You don't understand," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He was going to change his will next week. Everything I worked for, everything I endured." Maxwell sat heavily in his chair, the weight of betrayal visible in the slump of his shoulders. The man who had built a tech empire, who had weathered countless corporate takeover attempts and business rivalries, looked suddenly older, more vulnerable. His eyes fixed on the wine glass that had nearly been his last drink, then slowly moved to Tommy, who stood awkwardly by the table, unsure whether to stay or slip away. "You," Maxwell said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You saw what nobody else did. You spoke up when it would have been easier to walk away." Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his worn sneakers scuffing against the expensive carpet. I couldn't let her hurt you," he mumbled, looking down. "It wasn't right." As the police led a still protesting Sarah toward the exit, other diners began approaching their table. "That boy is a hero," someone called out. "He saved your life," added another. The maitre d', who had earlier tried to remove Tommy, now stood red-faced and apologetic. "Mr. Stone, if there's anything we can do." But Maxwell wasn't listening to them. He was studying Tommy with new eyes, taking in the boy's threadbare jacket, his thin frame, the intelligence and determination in his young face. "Sit down, son," he said, gesturing to the chair Sarah had vacated. "Please." The request carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed, but there was a gentleness in it too. Tommy hesitated for a moment before slowly lowering himself into the plush seat, feeling out of place among the crystal and fine china. His stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, reminding everyone that this wasn't just a hero, this was a hungry child who had chosen to help others despite his own needs. Maxwell signaled to a nearby waiter. "Bring us everything from the menu," he said quietly, then turned back to Tommy. "When was the last time you ate, son?" The boy's fingers nervously played with the edge of the pristine tablecloth. "Yesterday morning," he admitted. "The shelter was out of food when I got there last night." The billionaire's face softened, lines of grief giving way to something else, purpose, perhaps. "You're not staying at a shelter anymore," he said firmly. "But first, tell me your story. How did you end up here?" His voice carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity and concern. Tommy swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the elaborate table setting before him. "My parents," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "they died in a car crash last year. No other family wanted me. Foster homes didn't work out. So I just..." He gestured vaguely at himself, "ended up here. On the streets." The first plates of food began arriving, soups, appetizers, elegant dishes Tommy had never seen before. His mouth watered, but he didn't reach for anything until Maxwell nodded encouragingly. "Eat," the older man said softly. "We have all night to talk." As Tommy carefully picked up a spoon, trying to mimic the proper etiquette he observed around him, Maxwell leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, watching the boy take his first cautious sip of soup, "I started with nothing too. Lived on the streets for a while when I was young. Everyone said I'd never amount to anything." He paused, a faint smile crossing his face. "But it only takes one person to change everything. For me, it was a librarian who caught me sleeping in the public library. Instead of throwing me out, she gave me books about computers. Those books changed my life." Tommy looked up from his soup, his eyes wide. "Really? You were..." He gestured at the elegant restaurant around them, "like me?" Maxwell nodded, his expression serious. "Which is why I know talent and character when I see it. You could have ignored what you saw tonight. Could have walked away. Most people would have. But you didn't. That kind of moral courage, you can't buy that. You can't teach it. It's either in your heart or it isn't." Tommy had just finished his second plate when Maxwell pulled out his phone. "Give me a moment," he said, stepping away from the table. The boy could hear fragments of conversation, something about immediate arrangements, paperwork, and a guest suite. The restaurant had begun to empty, the evening's drama fading into whispered conversations and backward glances, but the warmth of the food in Tommy's stomach made everything feel somehow distant, like a dream. When Maxwell returned, his face had transformed. The earlier shock and betrayal had been replaced by determination. "Tell me, Tommy," he said, settling back into his chair, "what would you do if you could do anything? If all the doors were suddenly open to you?" The question caught Tommy off guard. He'd spent so long just trying to survive that dreams felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. But something in Maxwell's eyes made him answer honestly. I always wanted to be a doctor," he said softly. "When I was little, before everything happened, I used to watch these medical shows with my mom. And now, on the streets, I see so many people who need help, but nobody cares about them." Maxwell nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "I just made some calls," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "There's a suite ready at the Grand Hotel for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll start the paperwork for a proper guardianship arrangement, if you're willing. Full medical care, the best education, everything you need." He paused, watching Tommy's eyes grow wide. "Your life changes tonight, son. If you want it to." Tommy's hands began to shake. "But, Why, he whispered. You don't even know me. Maxwell reached across the table, placing his weathered hand on Tommy's shoulder. Because 30 minutes ago, you proved you have something that all my money can't buy, integrity. You risked everything to save a stranger's life. Now it's my turn to save yours. 1 month later, the headlines had changed. Where there had once been stories about Sarah Stone's attempted murder of her billionaire husband, now there were photographs of Maxwell Stone standing proudly next to a transformed Tommy at the opening of the Stone Foundation for Youth Empowerment. Tommy wore a new suit, tailored to fit his now healthier frame, but his eyes held the same determined intensity that had saved Maxwell's life that night at Le Maison. The foundation's first project was converting an abandoned building into a state-of-the-art shelter and education center for homeless youth. Tommy had insisted on being involved in every aspect of its planning, drawing from his own experiences to ensure no detail was overlooked. Every kid deserves a chance, he told reporters, his voice confident despite his young age. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them first. Maxwell watched from the sideline as Tommy guided visitors through the new facility, pointing out the medical clinic, the classroom spaces, and the dormitory rooms. He's already started tutoring some of the younger kids in science, Maxwell told a group of impressed board members. Says it's practice for medical school. His voice carried the unmistakable pride of a father. The security footage from that fateful night at Le Maison had gone viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. But what caught people's attention wasn't just the dramatic arrest or the prevented crime, it was the moment when a homeless boy chose to step forward and save a stranger's life, proving that heroism doesn't wear a suit or carry a bank balance. You know what the best part is? Tommy said to Maxwell as they left the foundation's opening ceremony. Now when I see someone who needs help, I can actually do something about it. Maxwell smiled, remembering his own words from that night about how it only takes one person to change everything. He hadn't known then just how true those words would prove to be, not just for Tommy, but for himself as well. Back at Le Maison, where it all began, Maxwell and Tommy now sat at the same table every month to discuss the foundation's progress. The waiters who had once tried to shoo Tommy away now greeted him by name, and his favorite soup was always ready before he even ordered. But more importantly, the restaurant had become a symbol of how life can change in an instant, not just through luck or fate, but through the courage to do what's right. Sarah Stone's trial had made headlines, revealing a history of similar attempts with previous wealthy partners. But that wasn't the story people kept telling. Instead, they talked about the boy who had nothing but gave everything, who chose to speak up when others would have walked away. They talked about how real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in the courage to stand up for what's right. As Tommy prepared for his upcoming high school entrance exams, supported by the best tutors Maxwell could find, he never forgot those nights on the street. Every weekend, he returned to his old neighborhood, not as a homeless child anymore, but as living proof that hope can wear many faces. The other street kids called him Doc now, even though he was years away from medical school, but the nickname carried their dreams as much as his. Maxwell had changed too. The hard-driving businessman who had once measured success in stock prices and acquisitions now found himself measuring it in transformed lives. The foundation grew, spreading to other cities, each new location carrying the same message. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage come from those society has forgotten, and the truest wealth lies not in what we have, but in what we give. In the end, this isn't just a story about a homeless boy who saved a billionaire's life, or about a wealthy man who gave a child a second chance. It's about how heroes don't always wear capes or carry titles. Sometimes they wear worn-out sneakers and threadbare hoodies. Sometimes they're the people we pass by every day without a second glance. And sometimes, just sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand up, speak out, and remind us all that courage knows no tax bracket, and kindness has no price tag. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are countless Tommies out there right now, waiting for their chance to show the world their worth. The only question is, will you be the one to notice them? Will you be the one to speak up, to take action, to make a difference? Because in the end, we all have the power to change someone's world. We just have to be brave enough to try.